open mind.
Hi, Brad. Thanks for joining us. Very, very good of you to take the time to do so. I want to start off by talking about what it is you do and your official title, because as long as I've known you, I found that you are Professor of Violence and Aesthetics. Was that advertised, that job? Did that come up and you go, well, funnily enough, I'm completely qualified for that role?
No. Well, I was because I was previously at Bristol University, and then I was invited over to do an interview at Bath University, and then they offered me the position, and then through that they basically said, well, what would you like your title to be? So then I just
Nice.
Yeah, so, I could have gone for the kind of generic, well, professor of politics, but then I thought, well, I might as well just push this a bit. I might not get the opportunity again to give myself my own title. So, and those are the main themes of my work, really, in terms of, that's the main areas I've been very much concerned with for the past 20 years. And my research is around, first of all, well, political violence, but very broadly conceived in terms of what do we understand. And maybe we can dig into that a bit, but around, political violence. And then the aesthetic field, and I think part of it has been around, I guess, a recognition that we live in a very image-conscious society. But I think for me, the big challenge of our times really is how do we not just do justice to concepts, but also justice to images? How do we make sense of images, and how do we interrogate them? And especially in an age of the oversaturation of images. So I've been very much kind of trying to bring those two fields together, and also trying to say that, that as conceptually, but also in terms of ideas of aesthetics, that we need to take the arts and humanities much more seriously in terms of what we do. And that there's nothing more political in terms of the longevity than art. And I think that that's often underplayed, the political importance of art as much as the social importance of art, and recognizing that. And so that's been the kind of the bridges that I've tried to build in my own research, really.
Well, I suppose, excuse me, we can sort of dive right in, because one of the things that always interests me if there's any change of government oncoming, I'm not talking about England now, but what has just happened here in Wales, is from my point of view, I'm always interested to see what their attitude toward the art and the cultural industries, in inverted commas, are going to be. And particularly, without being political at all, but particularly with Plaid now being the largest party, because nationalism is so tied up with certain particular ideas of culture. So I'm very interested to see what the next steps in that particular sphere is going to be in Wales.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think first of all, you can tell a great deal about a person in terms of their relationship to the arts and how they engage with the arts, and in terms of the kind of politics that they have. And I think this idea that the arts are separate from politics, we know, is an utter nonsense. Although I'm very skeptical of art which is too explicitly political as well, and I think that's a different thing to discuss. But I agree with you that you can tell a lot about a lot of political movements and organizations in terms of their relationship to the arts, and in terms of their their willingness to support it. And I think also, it's one of the tragedies of our times, I think, that often, as is the case, whenever there's a crisis or a catastrophe, or especially a financial crisis, the arts are always the first to receive the hit and the first to get cut. And yet they are the things actually you need the most in times of catastrophe and crisis. You look at, for instance, the COVID pandemic, how many people relied on the arts to basically just to get them through, right? And so I think that, and then we look in the time in which we live, that there is a clear kind of crisis of the arts and humanities. And all the crises we face, whether it's locally in terms of communities like South Wales, or globally in terms of the power of big tech, it's very clear for us that we never needed the arts and humanities more than what we do than we do today, and yet it's chronically underfunded. And I think that is the real challenge for us.
Well, I think that's why I'm so interested to see what Plaid Cymru's ideas about funding the arts in Wales is going to be, because as we were saying, the idea of a nationalist government, they're so intrinsically linked with culture, with art and culture. And although, as I say, specific ideas of it might not be quite as nuanced or broad. I mean, it could be, but I'm saying, the history of nationalist governments around the world have had very different but very specific ideas of what art and
Mhm.
even to the point of propaganda, obviously, the very
Yeah.
specific ideas of what art and culture should be.
Mm. Well, I think there's I say there's an important history there in terms of, if you're going to create an identity and you create a culture and you create people to buy into the idea of being Welsh, and that there is all these kind of cultural attributes which they don't come from nowhere. They have to be constructed, they have to be promoted, they have to be create given part of the story of Wales, which is as much as it has to be poetic and as visualized as it is just written in terms of rational language and so forth. And we know in terms of the history of Wales how important its arts have been to the development of its own national identity. And as you say, that there is that sense where you think, I say, it'd be interesting to see where Plaid go, because you don't want them just to simply promote almost like this propagandist nationalistic art, and I think but I don't think Wales needs that anymore. The identity is pretty much, it's no longer an emerging identity that to what it perhaps was even in the Thatcher period, where we're still kind of fighting for that sense. I don't think anybody who's born in Wales today doubts that Welshness anymore, so I think that identity is there, but it's more about now, how does that identity push forward a vision of what Wales could become, rather than just actually stating, "Look, we're here and we deserve to have this rigorous identity, which we can call our own." It's more about now how the arts actually can allow Wales to fulfil its own potential and its own vision of what it could become. I think and that's which is also integral to ideas around regeneration and social cohesion and all those issues, social justice for people in communities like in South Wales Valleys. So I think there is that role for the arts now. It's not just about consolidating what an identity is, actually, but it's more about actually what it could become in the years ahead.
What do you think about Plaid's victory? I mean, victory. They're the largest party. I suppose they're claiming it as a
Mm,
victory. What do you think of it generally? Because I sort of feel it's the only. Um, I mean, without betraying any of my own politics, I'm not a nationalist, as I've written about before.
mm.
But it felt like the only really positive story to come out of the UK after the election. Scotland kind of had this like, well, we're sticking with the SNP, but they've got a smaller vote than they used to have. We're not that fussed on them. Obviously, England's in
Yeah.
a little bit of turmoil, but there seemed to be a
Mhm.
really positive attitude come out of the Welsh election.
Mm. Yeah, I think the elections are momentous. I think for a number of reasons. I think first of all, I think what it makes clear, I think in terms of Plaid now, is that it the Labour Party can no longer make the case that you vote for Plaid is a wasted vote. All right. I think that is clearly that's gone now, and I think Plaid are very clearly now a real serious contender in the political landscape. And I do think there's a broader history that's taken some time for that to mature, but certainly now this is a momentous shift. And I don't even know whether you would even go back now. Could you reimagine the Labour Party reclaiming the Senate anytime too soon? So I think this seems to be a momentous shift. And I think, as you say, in terms of the positive story, well, if it's Plaid or reform, right? I think this is the situation we're in now. But I think that there's a moment where, and it seems strange actually, where, if you look at it, in terms of, you often felt, well, maybe, Scotland or even Ireland historically would have been the ones who would have gone for independence first. But it seems like Wales is now better positioned actually for independence in terms of the population than actually what Scotland or Ireland would be. And I think that is also be interesting to see how that's navigated in the next few years. But I think at the moment, it's almost feels like now Wales is Plaid's to lose in terms of, I think they have shifted the parameters. The new leadership there seems very electable. I think that's the difference as well, right? Uh, and I think they seem to have learned mistakes from the past. They don't overpromise, which I think is very good. But also, the last election campaign, they were just dealing with people's everyday local issues. Actually, not so much talk about independence, and not talk about I'm not getting caught up into so much of that kind of vitriolic politics around that and the politics of identity, but just genuine concerns which everyday people are going through. And I think it was a remarkable campaign for them. And I think that as you say, it is the good story. I'm the same. I've never been a Welsh nationalist, and I think that's perhaps part of our generation as well. We kind of grew up loathing a bit of Wales, right? So in that sense of that self-deprecating, everything's going to be a tragedy, so we can't trust ourselves to go into the future because the future is so tragic. But I think that there is on that level, that is an interesting shift nationally. I think there's a different complexity locally, in terms of especially the communities who feel like they need to vote for reform and the sense of hopelessness that's there. But I agree with you in terms of you look at right across the UK, it did seem to be the only positive story, which even the Nationals were picking up on, right? So,
Mm.
and I think that's the way, I didn't see even in the kind of the London press, nobody was presenting a bad story about Plaid. And, maybe 15 years ago, they would have been horrified about that. Oh no,
Mm.
the nationalists are coming for our island,
Yeah.
but now it was almost like, well, actually, this is a positive story for, even for the national press. So
And the length now that devolution has existed has played a big part in that. People in like the London press, you say, have kind of got used to the idea that
mhm,
the regions can govern themselves in certain respect. I also felt that the positivity came from a perception that it was a very clean win. Like Rian ap
mhm,
Iorwerth seems like a good guy. It was a positive campaign on the whole. I mean, there was a little bit of like, vote for us or you'll get reform. There was a bit of that going around, but it was a very positive campaign. Whereas the Greens have now got, Zach Polanski not paying council tax on his boat, and
mhm,
reform is just, always covered in controversy about corruption and money coming from God knows where. The
mhm,
SNP, but the Plaid vote, I don't know. It seemed, even though I'm not a Plaid man, I like it's, saying like I don't go back that way. I come from a South Wales Labour family, and
mhm.
it's been, I don't know. There was a period when it was heartbreaking to see what had happened to Labour. I got to a point, in recent years where it was just, I was just hoping to see the back of them, really, just for some freshness and for some. But yeah, it
Wow.
seemed like a very clean victory. There's no side to it. It was a good political campaign, and it
Yeah,
feels
and
it.
done
it
with done with dignity, right? And done with a sense that you could actually trust them, but also the willingness to draw clear lines between themselves and reform, which the Labour Party have strangely struggled to do. That they don't know whether they should go reform light or reform heavy, And I think that point with Plaid was like, no, we are not that kind of politics. And I think they were actually the first, perhaps nationally, to really do that, And I know the Greens have tried to do it, but as I say, I think the Green Party, to me, I have serious issues with a lot of the stuff that they do anyway. But I think that that there was a sense of integrity coming back into the politics, and I think that was whether you like their policies or not. That's the one thing which has been missing since Tony Blair, right? I think there's that sense of the integrity of politics that vanished because everything was just show and no substance. So there seems to be some of that coming back with them, which I think is honourable, and long may that continue. So.
Wales Arts Review is back, and it's a podcast. Or rather, the new Wales Arts Review is being built before your very eyes around the central column of my conversations with some of the most interesting and vital cultural figures working today. But for us to survive and grow this time, we very much need your help. If you like what we're doing, like what we stand for, then like our posts, and most importantly, subscribe. The more subscribers to our Substack newsletter and YouTube channel, the better placed we will be to grow and pay writers to tackle the most pressing cultural subjects of the day. Via Substack, you can become a paid subscriber and gain access to exclusive content and an ever-growing Wales Arts Review archive. And by hitting the subscribe button on our YouTube channel, not only do you let the platform know you'd like to see more of our stuff, but you increase the chances of us drawing down revenue from ads. All that goes back into Wales Arts Review to help us grow and improve. We need your support. Press those buttons and then go and enjoy our stuff. It's all for you anyway.
Well, for them to remain in power for, like Labour did for a generation or whatever, they need to continue to see off the reform vote, don't they? Now, when we talked recently, we talked about your experience of going back to the South Wales valleys where you were brought up, and we'll come to talk about that a little bit more. How do you think what I was going to say was the one thing that I think everybody has commented on with Labour across the UK is that they've completely forgotten how to communicate with their traditional vote, their traditional core vote. So, and that vote in South Wales, in the valleys, in traditional working class communities, seems to have drifted more towards reform than it has towards Plaid. Now, how do Plaid, in cultural terms, I suppose, how do they go into those communities and convince people that they are the answer and not reform? I mean, when I say in cultural terms, I mean you can instigate policies that change their lives or change aspects of their lives. But how do you think they go into those communities and tell people that, this is the vision worth investing in?
Well, I think it's first of all having an acute appreciation of the history of the valleys, and I think we know ever since we're coming close to the anniversary of the Aberfan disaster. I think in many senses there's been a slow decline of the hold of the Labour Party in the Welsh valleys, which goes back to Aberfan, I think, and that moment where suddenly the Labour government and its role in that, and I think that slow decline in the valleys of there was clearly there. And I think even by the time then Tony Blair arrives, in that moment in the Welsh valleys, there was a clear sense of dejection with politics and apathy with politics, but there was no alternative, right? So in that sense, you had to basically just vote for Labour, otherwise it was the Tories, and I think that was still the hold. But I think the social media landscape has changed that political dynamic clearly, and the massive collapse in party membership has adjusted that. Now, I think for looking at the Welsh valleys, one of the things which I've sensed more and more going back, and it's been very noticeable, I think the last 6 years especially, where you've seen communities there now who have gone from a sense of dejection and apathy, particularly a younger generation, was very angry and that sense of hostility, which political parties like Reform are utterly parasitic to. They will feed off that growing sense of anger, and an anger which has been exacerbated in the age of social media, and we know that's the case anyway, and which has led to the further collapse of the hold the Labour Party's had there. Now, I think for Reform, and sorry, for Plaid, it's about, okay, how do they first of all go in there and and appreciate the complex and tragic history of places like the valleys, but also it's simply just speaking in, as they did, I think, in this election, just and they did it well in Caerphilly as well. In the election there was just speaking everyday language to people and addressing local concerns and doing it in a way which is the big problem with so much of leftist politics today, which is, especially the way it's paraded from an academic sense, is it's very condescending to, I wouldn't even call them working class communities anymore, because I don't even know, many of them don't even work, right? But that getting beyond that kind of, we know what's best for you, and that sense of academic condensation, or we have all the answers to your plight. People in the valleys, as you know, are very suspicious of that anyway, of outsiders coming in and promising to save them, because they've had enough of that failure, and I think it's about how do they connect with the local communities and give them a sense of hope, because the thing that strikes with the valleys at the minute is just a real sense of hopelessness, especially amongst young kids, and especially those who you think should have a sense of the future. And that even when I think myself, like growing up in the valleys, in the 80s and 90s, you knew the valleys were tough and they were bleak, but you never had the sense that you couldn't escape or do something if you wanted to. I think for a lot of kids in the valleys, they don't feel that anymore. And I think that's going to be the real challenge, I think, is how do they tap into those younger generations and make them feel like that, that they should have a voice in terms of what they're doing. So.
I'm interested in that idea of talking to communities in their own language, and one way to do that is to bring people from those communities to be community leaders, isn't it? Which I think is something that Welsh politics. It seems that there's not just a political and cultural divide between Plaid and Reform. Reform seems very much about parachuting people in, and rather than bringing people out of the communities. But I wonder as well if there are several steps away from the idea of the arts and propaganda when it comes to nationalist governments. Turning, I mean, I wasn't expecting to talk quite about this, but turning the idea of where the public money for arts goes from these big nationalist projects that are supposed to go out and show Wales off to the international community, and returning it perhaps to where it was 30, 40 years ago, and making sure that people in Treorchy can see a play, and people in,
Mm.
you know, investing back into communities. I think that's a vote winner for Plaid. I mean, I've rarely seen anything as powerful as when I used to lecture, and I would say, oh, there's a play on down the riverfront in Newport tonight. If anybody gets to go and see it, you should see it. It's really good. And then I see them the following week, and their lives are changed because they've never been to the theatre before. You know, the attachment of those working class communities to any type of art, that being able to introduce them to that, I think,
Yeah.
in a cynical way, is a surefire vote winner for someone like Plaid.
And also, and that's the thing, right? In terms of, like, understand, like, places like the valleys. First of all, there is a real rich history of arts in the valleys. And for instance, like, my great grandfather set up the Ystrad of Fodog Art Society. At the turn of the last century. And it had a thriving membership base, and as you say, all the cinema complexes and everything that was set up throughout the valleys, and the theatres and so forth. And I was having this conversation with somebody the other day about, okay, what would it take to kind of seriously regenerate the Welsh valleys? And as you say, and it has to be, if you look at kind of, development models elsewhere, particularly in zones of deprivation and crisis, it's often actually when artists move in that quickly actually a sense of gentrification can happen. And I'm not saying exploit the artists, because then you can result, the last thing we want is to gentrify the valleys, but I do think that there is a sense in which that you can see the way in which economic development always often follows an artistic revolution in a local area. And I think you look across the valleys, the one thing the valleys does have in abundance is all these remarkable old chapel buildings, which could so easily be repurposed into hubs of community activity, into thriving art centres. You drive up through, even like Tom Pentre, where my parents were from. You go into the local town. There's these massive buildings just boarded up. And it's not like it doesn't have the infrastructure there to create all these hubs of artistic activity right across the valleys, and you've got no idea where that could lead. And yes, it's a bit of a risk, but certainly you'd say, well, investing in the arts and in social inventiveness and all those kinds of things we know which spark the imagination, that has to be a precursor for local development. And in that sense, then that's where I think, as you say, Plaid, it's all well and good investing in Cardiff, but we know again, when I was growing up, and I think it's the same for young kids when I speak to them in the valleys now, Cardiff still feels a world away for many of them. And that sense of the arts being still alienating to them and feeling like they have no part to play in it. And if they feel like they have no part to play in that, how can they feel like they have a part to play in the cultural life of the nation going forward? So I think that's a real challenge then for them.
How do you feel? Because you say you go back to where you were from quite often. How do you feel when you go back now?
It's tragic in a lot of ways, because I always, part of my thing when I was growing up was, this sense of wanting to escape the valleys and wanting to, leave the valleys and prove that you could just get away from there, and for all the kind of, the lack of opportunities, but also, the mountains are beautiful when you go back now, but then when you're young and you're growing up there, they feel like prisons, right? There's this, and the atmosphere of the valleys, it pretty much rains and it's grey all the time, and that's the topography there. But when I go back now, it's tough, because I see, in some ways there's a dejection and the sense of abandonment which I felt was very difficult, but also you could kind of deal with. What worries me more now when I go there is, the last time I went back there was, everybody in the local village, but even then, for the first time I think I've ever felt it, of a sense of hesitancy walk into the local store because of the potential for violence and so on. And you see that change happening in the valleys, where you notice if you kind of step out and then go back and you see those incremental decreases. And I think that would be my worry, my overriding feeling of the valleys now, is that it no longer feel safe, even when it was impoverished. You never felt, okay, Friday night was always, fight night, but that was kind of, that was just local pub activity. But I do think there was never that sense of just a different kind of politically motivated violence, which seems to be very much bubbling there. It hasn't risen so much to the surface yet, but I don't think it's far away. And I think that's my overriding feeling is one of genuine worry, I think, for the people there now.
But you did manage to get out. I mean, it's a fascinating story. You talk about in your autobiography, um, your childhood and the impoverishment of the community as well, but particularly for you and your family. And it is an amazing story. And I wonder, like, you were sort of hinting at before, if your type of journey would be possible for any kids i- from where you're from today, in the valleys in particular. Um,
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean,
but it was really interesting when we so yeah, based off the book, I did this 2-part BBC radio series called Despair to Where, and we went back to Penrhys, which is the housing estate where I grew up on, and you see, a few young kids there, but I agree in a sense where when I interviewing some young kids there and also some young kids in the Merthyr area as well, that in many senses, the idea of university, which for me was very alien right up until the age of 17, um, seems further away from them now than what it did for me. And given the current financial regime of a university, there's no way in a million years I would have gone to university now in this current climate, given the background that I had, and that to me is a real tragedy and it's a real worry. How do you make sense of these? Well, you think they should have more opportunities, and there seems to be less. And I say when I was interviewing a group of young girls, and and that was troubling to me, the sense of hopelessness amongst these young girls, and the fact of university feeling so far away from them. And I know university is not the answer to everything, but I do think that, yeah, I agree with you that actually it would probably be arguably even more difficult for somebody from, so I grew up in a benefits family where, parents really struggled through that. And through a great deal of luck ended up where you do really, and that, when you grew up in a situation of poverty, most of your outcomes yes, you can do hard work or whatever, but you need a great deal of luck along the way, not falling in with the wrong crowd, not falling in with whatever else, right? But I just think that the chances of young kids today in a similar circumstance, you know, I'd love to think that, a young kid growing up on the Gurnos estate or in Penrhys could suddenly, end up in 20 years' time, doing the kind of journey which I managed to do and then becoming a university professor. But I think it's less possible today, I think. And that's a real tragedy because it was unlikely then. But I think even today it's even more challenging, I think.
I want to keep on talking about your childhood and how you sort of got to where you are. But something, when you were talking, then something occurred to me. I was having this conversation the other day about how much it gets my back up when I hear politicians pretty much 50 times a day refer to working families, working people, working families. And I'm interested in what you think of that new euphemism that's been developed over the years, because as I say, I was having a conversation about this the other day, and I feel like it's as much of a dog whistle
Mhm.
as any of the racist stuff you see coming out of the far left and the far right, because it means things to people that it might not mean to you, and everyone will
Mhm.
be sure what it means. It means to some people, oh, the government means they're not doing all this work for people on benefits. But
Yeah.
but to me, it means it's a euphemism for whatever is the fact there is no working class anymore.
Mhm.
I'd be very offended by hearing every cabinet minister come out every day and talk about working hard for working people. I'd be very offended if I was on disability benefits.
Yeah, and the thing is, you look at the valleys as well, that so like my own story was my father was well chronically disabled. And, my parents were 19 when I was born. From the age of 20, then my father was chronically disabled. So physically, but also he had serious mental issues for many years as a result of the physical challenges that he had. So completely incapable of working, right? So we lived then basically on state benefits, and because of the lack of support for my father, other than state benefits, my mother became a full-time carer. But a full-time carer, which at that age was unpaid, right? It was just it's just something you had to do. There was no carer's allowance when that during that kind of period. So for my parents, their story was, and ours was, well, we were just basically a benefits family. So even then, in that moment where you're thinking of like the 80s and the 90s, where the very idea of the post-industrial society, the working class in itself is becoming a category which is a bit of a misnomer in any way. But then you see that shift in terms of, for us was, we were never working class, right? That just didn't apply. Now you could say, well, in the context of like, people in the family in the valleys, you could say, well, on the one hand, you could say, well, this term of working families, I know people in the valleys who, trying to basically make ends meet to have 3 jobs, right? So, okay, are they 3 times working families, right? In terms of, what these people are doing. And then on the other side, we have seen, the very clear, you don't need an elaborate political or economic theory to simply go to places like the valleys and make the direct link between poverty and ill health, right? It's clear, right? The poverty and ill health connection is evident. But now, and I think what's interesting, and I talked about a bit about this in the book, where the valleys in some ways the symbolism of, the move away from the black lung of the miners now to the ailing heart of obesity, and you see the chronic conditions of obesity and all the mental and the physical challenges that poses for communities like the Welsh Valleys, and the ill health that goes with that, and then the rising of disability. And then it's all well and good to say, well, people need to eat better and they need to become healthier, but that's not easily done when you're living on meager money anyway. And I think that, unless you address those issues, then, and I agree, then, that sense of what does the working family actually mean for communities where it's not that people don't want to work. And that's the thing. I don't. Very few people actually choose not to work, and I think that, but I think what's lacking there is when there is no work, what does that mean? Or when you're incapable of working. And I think, and I saw my dad struggle throughout all his life, with that sense of feeling a kind of indignity for not working. And if he could have worked, he would have. Right? It's not a case of, and I think that's the case for so many people on disability benefits. Given the opportunities, they would do, but it's just the body or the mind, whatever, just doesn't allow them to. And I think that's also a part of a conversation that needs to be had. That, and as you say, it becomes part of this. It's almost like a polite way of playing into the same language, which comes from the right in many ways.
Yeah, I when I hear Labour politicians use these phrases, I just wonder who it is they're talking to. Because if I was in a jobless area on disability benefits, struggling to make ends meet, living in the valleys, I'd be thinking, well, you're not here talking to me. You don't understand my life. You're not talking to me. It feels like a new euphemism for the idea of the deserving and the undeserving poor. That's what I hear when I hear it. And they're talking to centre-right voters, and in another way, they're talking to far-right voters. They're talking to people who would refuse to vote for a political party that suggests there should be a welfare system for people who have fallen under the line.
Yeah, and it's precisely about who is deserving, right? And this is the myth, I think, which often just hovers there. That, and you see this playing out time and time again, locally and internationally. This poor communities have this sense of, okay, every time there's a major crisis, it's always the poorest communities which are affected the most, and that's pretty clear. And you see this now in terms of what's happening in the Middle East is having a profound impact on energy bills and energy consumption. Look at the profits of organizations like Shell and BP. It's not as if the money's gone, right? It's not as if it's any harder to get the oil. It's there and it's in the system. It's just an opportunity for profiteering. But also you see with the South Wales Valleys, there's communities there which are some of the poorest in terms of, fuel poverty in the United Kingdom. and yet literally above their house you have these giant wind masts. How can it be possible in in a circumstance where you have one of the largest onshore wind farms in Europe, literally above some of the most impoverished fuel communities in the United Kingdom? Heat poverty is a massive thing in the South Wales valleys, and yet they have this massive, wind farm behind them. And you think, well, how does those circumstances be allowed to happen, and in a way where, and I say this, it's not like there's not the resources to resolve these issues. There's just a lack of political will to help those local communities.
Why do you think there is a lack of political? I mean, we could be as cynical as we like, can't we? But perhaps that's not quite appropriate. I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that there is. I mean, you've written quite extensively and really well on Aberfan and the cultural importance of it that still lingers. The 60th anniversary, obviously coming up, and it just seems to me that as a nation of storytellers, as Wales is often cliched as being, the importance of telling those stories is about developing our understanding of what we as a nation deserve and what we don't have. And I mean, I've been as guilty as anybody really of sort of occasionally seeing another mural of Llywelyn, and you kind of think, oh God, isn't it time to sort of forget and move on now? But it is important, isn't it? I mean, I've learned that it's important to know that even though the people banging on about it might not share my politics, it's important to know that people need to understand their story, and that fits into the trajectory of Plaid as well, I suppose.
Yeah, and the story's never resolved, right? The story's always a kind of an evolving story. It's always, transforming and takes on new meaning. And I think, but I do think, the one thing which, particularly like older generations, my grandfather was just a brilliant storyteller, and that sense of, which again was very much part of the fabric of mining communities. I think what perhaps places like the valleys are struggling with is, they don't know what their story is today, because it's almost like, well, the only story that is to speak of is a nostalgic one. And it's a story which speaks now to a past which was also very brutal and tragic. And, that kind of, I'm always deeply skeptical of the romanticization of the mining industry, because who the hell really wanted to go and work down in a pit? But it was better than nothing, right? And it created a sense of community, and it created a sense of belonging. And as in, that's part of the story of, not just the story of the valleys. I think, what the mining community is part of the story of Wales, an integral part of, the mythology of Wales, and I think then perhaps what's happened now in this current moment is, okay, when for people in the valleys, what it feels like almost like the story has stopped in some ways, and then you kind of slip back into a nostalgia, but a nostalgia which is also deeply melancholic, because then every time you hear now the sound of the male voice choirs, it's no longer a triumphant, it's always a melancholic news story, right? With the male voice choirs are singing because there's another tale of deprivation in the valleys and so on. And I think perhaps where Reform are jumping into that is, Reform are a party which also plays on nostalgia. That's what they do. That's their shtick, right? They latch onto nostalgia and say, you can be, almost like in a Trump language, you can be great again, right? Well, for the people in the valleys, things were never great, but there is a sense of something has been lost, and maybe that sense of loss has been at least being perhaps the authors of your own part of a story. And I think that's the one thing which I think has been taken from particularly places like the valleys, that sense of, what, we are somewhat in control of our own destiny. Yes, we know there's external forces, and we know there are forces greater than us, and yes, we know we're exploited, but still we have the capacity to be creative in our resistance. And I think perhaps that's what's being lost in the valleys now, is that creativity of the resistance, which came from a collective sense of belonging and community cohesion and so on, which has been completely robbed from the place, really.
The thinking of the murals, the drawing of the Cofiac Llywelyn about the flooding of the village,
Mhm.
that sort of coming back a few years ago. I mean, from your point of view as a professor of aesthetics as well as political violence, that must have been a really interesting phenomenon of that just appearing on rock sides all around Wales and having this sort of resurgence of this idea of resistance and unfairness and the violence perpetrated upon the landscape of Wales for English benefit, really.
Mhm. Well, I think, first of all, to me, if there's one word which defines South Wales and the valleys, it's extraction, right? So the history of Wales in itself has been a history of extraction, and the valleys has very much concentrated that. And I agree in that sense of course, an extraction, which is whether it's the extraction of minerals or the extraction of lives and the extraction of, wealth and everything that goes with that. Now, the importance then, as you say, in terms of the resurgence of these artistic senses of memorialization of events which are deeply tragic, right? And you talk about the tragedy of the memory of exploitation and extraction. As you say, I think the memory is important, but the memory is important not because it remains time capsuled, but it's how it speaks to the present moment and what's that art really trying to do. There's I've often been taken by the writings of the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, and Deleuze has this brilliant thing about that the best form of resistance is creation. And he argues that to create is to resist. He says, it's not about saying no, it's about saying yes. Resistance is not a no to something; it's always a yes to something. And you do see there's moments in Welsh history where that really comes to the fore. And you think about then, as you say, the defiance is still there. I think that's perhaps of the problem of, in Wales, we know we can be, a defiant, stubborn bunch, right? But I think for all the good reasons sometimes, the problems I think is marking the political landscape today is, where do you channel that defiance? Where do you channel that anger? Where do you, how do you turn that into something which is very productive, very generative, very transformative? And I think, there is, again, a rich history of that. But it seems in the present moment, especially with, movements like reform, as you say, they're jettisoning in and trying to steer all that energy in a very particular direction. And I think it's a direction which is ultimately self-defeating for the communities of South Wales.
I was thinking the other day after the election results, thinking about art and politics and how they intertwine. And now, of course, the big theatrical event for Wales of this year is the Owain and Henry from Michael Sheen's Welsh National Theatre, which is coming up towards the end of the year, which I think they're missing a trick if they don't rebrand it as Rhiannon Keir. I think that would absolutely be the but it's going, there's definitely going to be a different colour to it now, isn't there? Now with a Welsh nationalist government, as opposed to, I mean, I was going to say as well, like, how different do you think the context of the memorialising of Aberfan this year is going to be now that Labour aren't the government who played such an important, damnable role in the whole thing? Now that they're out of the way and there's new people in to sort of memorialise it, do you think that would make a difference as well?
Well, I think first of all, in terms of the point about I first of all, I think Michael Sheen in himself is great, and I like what he's done for Wales on the international stage and the way in which he has been, perhaps something which, I'm not saying comparable to Richard Burton, but certainly has done something there, which I think is very admirable. And I really, think that there's a lot to admire in what he's done. However, like you say, wouldn't it be so wonderful if, Michael Sheen popped up right across the valleys, right, and took these kind of things on a tour to all the different, rather than everything again centered in Cardiff. I understand you need the venues, but it's not as if those venues don't exist, right? So to me, it would be about how do you bring the art still back to the people, not just concentrating in Cardiff, because it's going to be an international success. Now, in terms of Aberfan, I think that the 50th anniversary was a very, there was a very somber poignancy to it, and again, it's one of those things where you think, well, sometimes people can kind of dwell too much in the history of a tragedy, and especially when a place becomes so marked by a tragedy, it's hard to think of them. Who can even mention that even the town Aberfan today without still thinking of that tragedy, right? Now, you could say, well, on the one hand, well, maybe the 60th anniversary is is a moment where it's not just, again, reflecting on the past, but has a sense of, perhaps at least with Plaid there now, of an opening. But, you know, I think when you look back at it, the symbolic death of so many young children in Aberfan was not only about the excesses of the coal industry, the lack of regard for those poor communities. In many ways, we could date the birth of what, geologists call the Anthropocene, which is the start of basically human interaction in terms of how we become the greatest force for change in terms of ecologies. Our first moment of awareness was probably Aberfan, because it's the first serious live televised moment of an ecological disaster we know was man-made internationally, not just even in terms of South Wales. So there is this real moment of reckoning around that catastrophe. Now, in many senses, what's interesting, you compare, like, for instance, a tragedy like that, for instance, to like a momentous event like September the 11th, 2001. What was remarkable about, going to New York even 10 years after 9/11 was how the city has just moved on. Okay, there's a bit of memorialization, but they're already building on the site. They're already developing. There was new cafes up where the old ones had been destroyed. The city moved on because it could financially move on, and it could create a new story for itself. The thing about the valleys with Aberfan was it becomes, was it like 5 years after 8 years after the disaster, when the Secretary of Education in Parliament says the South Wales valleys are dying, and I think you have that sense of the death of the children becoming utterly symbolic to the death of the future, and the death of the future which still lingers in the valleys today. So I think the reason why Aberfan as a disaster still has such a hold over the psychosis of the valleys is because, in many senses, they're still stuck in that tragedy. And it's not about the tragedy of the individual children who lost their lives, but that sense that the future is gone and the future has been taken. And I think that's why it has resonated so much now. Maybe, as you say, that the coming to power of Plaid could represent a new chapter and could actually be, okay, how does the future story of the valleys, can you write of a kind of a post Aberfan story for the valleys? And you think, well, yes, you'd like to think to restart it over and over, but there's still that sense of the prevailing narrative that dominates the Welsh valleys is a tragedy, and the multiple tragedies which are still there. So can the valleys lift itself out of the tragedy would be perhaps the poignant question for Aberfan as it approaches its 60th anniversary, in a moment now where the Labour Party is not the one that's in power. And I think that would be I like to think about this not just in terms of, again, standard political discourse or grammar, but how do we think about that aesthetically, right? How do we imagine the future of the valleys? How do we feel about that kind of aesthetic vision? And how does that aesthetic vision also latch on to the aesthetic vision of the future of, Wales as a country, which is led on the international stage by Michael Sheen? And I think all these things are connected in that way.
I mean, it could be, though, in the way we were just talking then, it could be a great sort of cultural opportunity for Plaid to take an anniversary of Aberfan and to say, well, now is time to use that symbolic energy of something, of that tragedy, to move on and to build a new story for the valleys.
Absolutely. And you say, okay, you have that kind of, that, utterly symbolic violence, which takes a matter of seconds to decimate not just a precarious community in the valley, in the heart of the valleys of South Wales, but the entire psychosis of South Wales and Wales in general. I think Aberfan had a profound psychological impact on Wales as a whole, and especially the South Wales region. And that it's still there, that sense of injustice, that sense of loss, that sense of, even when people work, even the workers who work hard, there is still that sense that things are not going to be okay for you, that, that the forces of history will sweep across you and just basically take you away like you're a disposable population. And I think then, that is the tragedy of the valley. So if I had anything to do with kind of Plaid's cultural strategy, you would say, well, yes, you get involved with the valleys and you say, look, let's not forget the tragedy. We are coming close. Well, we're over now. The South Wales valleys from the first signs of the Great Depression in the South Wales valleys were detected in 1922. Before the big Great Depression, which everybody talks about. And so so we've had 100 years of depression in the South Wales valleys, and I think in that sense, you think, well, now could be a cultural moment, and I think again that kind of shift. Before you promise economic development or political transformation, you have to get people to buy into the idea that the future can be imagined better. And I think that could be a cultural moment where Plaid could say, well, yes, let's really push this now, and let's not lose sight of the tragedy, but also let's really get local communities invested in the idea that they should be the authors of their own story going into the 21st century. And I think that would be a very compelling narrative. I think that they could push in a way which doesn't need to be divisive, doesn't need to be us versus them, and I think that would be another way that they could steer the ship going forward, I think.
Again, it feels like the potential for Plaid's story in power or in minority government could be a real positive force in a time where I think most people, I don't think I'm particularly strange in this, but most people have kind of forgotten what it feels like to have positivity in politics.
It's very difficult, isn't it? When I think, then, and I was, I get again chatting to a bunch of students about this the other day about, even like ourselves, Gary, we've, I've spent a lifetime in kind of education, and you've done, so much great stuff in terms of public broadcasting and engaging with publics and so forth. That both of us have this evident cynicism for politics, right? And you think, and you think, well, how do we get to this point? That, and I was saying to my students, I don't want to be nostalgic about this, but when I think back to like even the early 1980s and people like Margaret Thatcher, I know you shouldn't mention Thatcher in the valleys for sure to be lynching, but Thatcher or Tony Benn or whatever we thought of them, they were statespeople. And I never questioned their integrity. I never questioned they didn't believe in what they believed in, and I think that sense of where that gets lost, certainly during the 1990s, and that loss of the integrity in politics and the loss of just genuine statespeople who you believe in what they say and they are actually committed to politics, not because it's a stepping stone for something else, but actually they have a genuine sense of a commitment to, engage with these principles and ideas. And I think that general sense that we would have, and then then I then go to younger kids in the valleys and you see, and of course they're going to be apathetic. Of course they're going to think that, this system is not working for them. Of course, then they're going to be attracted to a political organization which comes in and says, you know what, the reason why you're poor is because of these people here. And giving them simple messages to complex problems. And then you think, well, you understand then that kind of animosity and, and again, that's one of the tragedies, that, there's nothing I like in terms of what reforms stand for, but I understand why local people have voted for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And
I understand as well the way. I mean, I've been arguing about this since the election. It's driven me mad that the left, identified as, in a sort of broadly a Remain sense, has had 10 years to find a way to win people over to their side of things, and all they've done is shout fascist at people for 10 years. They've had 10 years to go. The way that we gain power and that we change and implement a left-wing vision for this country is to go to the people who voted to leave the European Union, and we sell them our vision for this country, but all they've done is shout fascist at them and racist. It's I mean, the dereliction of duty by the left is incomparable, I think.
It's ridiculous, and again, you see these academic cheerleaders who jump on, anything to do with reform now, and everybody who votes for them is a racist or a fascist or whatever, everything else. I've known people in the valleys, good friends of mine who I went to school with, who said they're going to vote reform. These people, they're not fascists. They just they just believe that actually locally they're going to do better than what they've been offered. And it's not only a protest vote. And I think this is the point, right? That because there are speaking to local issues and local concerns, and they know how to do that. And I think that's the challenge for us, isn't it? That we have to, yes, we know at a national level, the politics are abhorrent in so many ways. But I also think that there's a way in which, like for me, that we have to, if we want to make sense of this, the last thing we can do is alienate these people who are voting for them further. You have to basically sit down with them and say, okay, so why are you trying to understand it? Why are you voting for this organization? Do you understand that when they come to power, they're going to deregulate things further, right? And
Yeah,
and
yeah,
try
yeah.
to have that conversation with them, and even these people say, oh, you shouldn't, engage a conversation with Nigel Farage. Of course you should. You should be taking him on even more. This finally, one of the only good things which Starmer did yesterday was suddenly say, you know what, Brexit was a disaster. It's like, it's
Mm,
taken them all this time to
yeah.
suddenly realize maybe that's the way we take them on. To let them realize that, that it's been an economic disaster, especially for South Wales. And you think, well, the university sector's collapsing as a result of it. And you think that Cardiff University, the financial troubles, or all the universities in Wales which are really struggling financially, the clear correlation with Brexit. It's not rocket science. And you think then that, that finally having that conversation, but I agree with you, suddenly, this kind of shouting, oh, you're all fascists now, that's going to, inspire people to vote all the more for them, especially knowing the
Oh,
side
yeah, absolutely.
of the Welsh. It's just,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You're not going to win anybody over by doing that. I was thinking with Starmer's reset speech as well. I mean, he may not be prime minister by the time this podcast goes out. We'll wait and see. Could go out in a couple of hours, and he might not be there. I don't know. But when I saw, I listened to it on the radio, but I saw a little bit of it on the news, and the way he sort of came out with his no tie and his sleeves rolled up, and I thought, God, this feels very old fashioned symbolism of I'm going to graft. I'm a grafter. I'm going to graft for working families. But
yeah,
what do you think about that kind of, to me, very tired, like 1990s kind of symbolism? Really,
yeah.
it spoke to me of a politician and whose team is really lagging behind in what the visuals of politics means to regular people on the street.
Yeah, I think so. And it looked tired. He looked tired. I don't even think he seemed convinced in the things that he was saying. And I think, and it's a shame in many ways, because you look at, on the face of it, he actually seems like a really nice guy. And he seems like, you look at his backstory, remarkable work around human rights work, remarkably principled guy. And it seems like he's gone into power and just become lost in terms
Mhm.
of, and, and
Yeah,
and I think part of the issue has been from the get-go, not sure whether they turn left or turn right. And I think trying to, you know, too many, you know, young people who are invested in them trying to give advice to the government, which is completely catastrophic. But utterly, and I still don't think that Labour really knows how to deal with its traditional working base in a post-industrial
mm,
society. They haven't, no sense of the optics, no sense of, and you kind of think, even the current discussions now around, it's kind of interesting, where you think on the one hand, it's quite clear that the crisis of the Labour Party is a crisis of the old typical kind of working class but poorer areas, and that kind, the old red areas where basically they're losing their base massively, and the media set in London seem to be constantly promoting Wes Streeting as the alternative.
yeah.
Wes Streeting is not going to take Labour away from reform in the Welsh Valleys.
No, no, my goodness,
Not
no.
in the slightest. And he's not going to do so in Burnley. He's not going to do so in, all these other areas. Wes Streeting is simply actually going to alienate them more. Burnham, maybe. Or Angela
Yeah,
Rayner, yes. Right. But
yeah,
Streeting, but it seems like this is what the London media class want, is Streeting is an acceptable alternative.
yeah,
And it'll be just as disastrous for them.
yeah, yeah. What do you think of Burnham? I, I,
I
I,
think,
I sort of feel like I don't know what I think of him because the
mhm,
North feels just like a different political
mhm,
universe to
yeah.
living in South Wales. But
I guess, I don't know. I don't think he's been tested enough on a big stage, so we know enough about him in that way. looks like he did a great job with Manchester. I really liked the way in which he responded to the stadium attacks in Manchester. I
Hmm.
think, I think that when he's called upon in certain moments of crisis, I think he's dealt with it very well. So
Similarly with the Hillsborough report, wasn't he? He was right
yeah, yeah.
front on getting that done. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think with him, he seems to be a doer, but I think, again, it's optics. Even his accent, he speaks in a way which resonates with ordinary people. And I
Mm.
think that is what, if the reaction to the Conservative Party was very much against that sense of entitlement and the sense of, look, we're no longer willing to accept this politics, and the attraction of reform, even though Farage is clearly not one of the people, he speaks in that kind of, I am one of you kind of thing, then Burnham would fit that mold in a way which would reform especially would find very challenging. So
It'd be a good fight, Burnham. That's what I keep thinking. Burnham versus Farage would be a good election.
I was thinking visually. Then I just
An
had
actual fight.
a UFC thing in my mind.
I'd like to see Farage in a fight with anyone, to be honest. I
Yeah.
could just see him wrestling on the floor trying to put cigarettes out in their arm.
Yes, but in terms of in terms of your background, Gary, in terms of how do you kind of sense this kind of cultural moment as well for Wales? In terms of you've been asking me about how did you think about the shift in culture, but do you think there's a real opening and a possibility with Plaid at the minute to change direction for Wales and push it into a more creative direction in that sense?
Oh, I think there's definitely potential for it. I mean, I'm not really in the mix anymore like I was before with Wales Arts Review and stuff. But my experience of Plaid politicians who I met was there's a few of them who, I mean, I won't say any names, and they haven't picked cabinet positions or anything like that yet, as far as I know. But there are people there who are genuinely like creative, cultural people who, I'd occasionally have a coffee with one Plaid MS, and it would be to talk about something to do with arts funding or something like that. And we do that for 5 minutes and then talk about, Dorothy Edwards or
Hmm.
Auden or, so they genuinely like culture people. And I never, without casting aspersions or anything, I never had that experience with any of the Labour lot.
Hmm.
Um, I never got the feeling that they were in any way passionate about art and literature and theatre, and
Hmm.
whereas I have had, I think that's just my sort of experience so I would like to think that because of also the potential for Plaid politically to use culture for their own, and again, I don't mean that in a kind of nefarious
Hmm.
propagandist way, but how you can bring, just like the health service and just like transport, how you can bring culture into your embrace as a political party to mean something to people that is attached to you as a brand. I think
Hmm.
they I think they've got people there who understand that. I don't
Hmm.
know really Nappy Earth at all, but
No.
they've definitely got people there who understand that, and people who would really love to have that portfolio. I mean, for so long, I made a joke about it in one of the books I wrote about, the minister for art, culture. Art was last. It was miniature for transport, sport, bicycles, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, art and culture. And it was for a long time. I think when Ken Skates was culture minister, his portfolio was so long, you definitely couldn't have fit art on his
Hmm.
business card because it came at the end. But
Hmm.
but yeah, I'm maybe I'm just desperate to feel positive about something political, and the fact that it is at home, it is where we are, rather than looking abroad at somewhere else and going, hey, well, that's a good sign. Maybe we can get that over here sometime soon. But
Yeah.
but yeah, I do feel like it'd be very interesting to see who he puts in his cabinet in certain positions, and as well, just the idea that there's going to be a load of people coming into government who are going to be chomping at the bit. You know,
Mhm.
like just the thought. Forget about the politics, but the thought of Labour getting back in Wales and having
Mhm.
those same people go back into those same positions and do the same things was was. I mean, yeah, that was a depressing thought. I mean, it was, that's not been that hadn't been the polling for 2 years, but the thought that you never know until it's all counted. But just
Mhm.
having new people there and
Yeah.
having seeing how the new electoral system, how that shapes decision making, that it's kind of designed to force um, collaboration between parties.
Mhm.
Um, and I
Well, I
think
think
I think they'll find as well. I think we'll all find that the number of times reform MSs are not degenerate horned devils, and they do actually come across and compromise and collaborate with things that Plaid want to get done. Because I think a lot of them will find, well, that's actually politically good for my constituents, and it'll get give me a good chance of getting voted back in. And who knows? Maybe some of them even care about those people.
yeah. Well, you'd
It's
hope
not
so,
an easy
right?
thing to
So,
give
yeah,
hearts and souls to reform people. I know, but
yeah, you'd hope so, but it was interesting you mentioned about health as well. And, and there are some, like I say, with the arts, that there are some quick fixes which could be introduced, which would have an immeasurable impact. The last few years I spent, quite a bit of time in Royal Glamorgan Hospital, my dad was, and the place itself is just, it's just so clinical, but it's run down as well. All they could do is a simple bit of artwork on the walls, right? Just to
yeah,
actually but it's not that complicated, and you think about, the places where you just need a bit of investment in art and a bit of investment in culture and just improving just the aesthetic feel of communities and places, and especially places such as hospitals and so on, where so many people in South Wales spend a great deal of time, the just increasing the showing actually that you respect people's dignity, I think, is a good start point, I think. And if Plaid, can deliver on that and listen to people and actually, and deliver on their promises, I think, it would be very hard, I think, to see Labour getting back in, I think, in any time soon.
mm, yeah, I think that's
Mm.
true. And then in 25 years, we'll be having the same problem that nobody's challenged Plaid for a generation, and they're just as
Generations.
hired
Yeah.
and clueless as Labour were. Not the opinion of the BBC, obviously. But
No, no,
so
no. But
what are you up to at the moment? What's next for you?
well, yeah. So for the alongside the works I've been doing around the Wales stuff. The main projects I've been working on over the past few years actually has been around disappearance, and this comes from a collaboration I did with my wife. So my wife who's a painter, and she's from Mexico, and we started working on issues around enforced disappearances in Mexico. And you might know, since like 2006, since the war on drugs in Mexico, there's 140,000 people disappeared in Mexico. And we've been working on a major project linked to that. We just did an exhibition actually at the Embassy of Switzerland in London, which was partnered with the International Committee of the Red Cross and the British Red Cross. And I'm just doing more kind of it kind of connects to the international, but also connects to local as well. The number of missing people in the UK, and also that kind of sense in which you know, I think there's something like 3,000 people registered missing in the UK. Many of them end up homeless on the British streets. So I've been very much concerned with the multiple ways in which humans just go missing or disappear,
Mm,
especially from those from conditions of poverty as well, which is a global story, and very much then rethinking, using that as a further opportunity to really, I guess, bridge the link between academia, art, and policy. And I think that's my big passion in many ways, is how do we create really meaningful conversations and collaborative projects between artists, academics, and policymakers, where they all feel like they're equal stakeholders. So, what was remarkable actually, like in this recent event we did at the Embassy of Switzerland, we'd put on an exhibition there, and we had, for instance, the UN Special Rapporteur for for extrajudicial killings speaking, number of ambassadors, and so on. Is how it can really work, right? You don't just make the art an add-on, but you make it an integral part of something which is linked to serious policy, serious intellectual discussion. We had people speaking about testimony of disappeared people in Syria. And what my experience shows that it is possible to do these things. And actually, the people from the policy world are also craving for something which looks a bit more imaginative, a bit more inventive. And you bring the art into those kinds of settings, as I say, not just as a way to just give a nice, okay, this is something to do once the talking's over and we'll take a look at the art, but actually it frames everything very differently. And I think so that's the ongoing passion that I have is very much around, how do we kind of deal with those links between art, academia and policymakers, and do so in a way which is very respectful of, all the things they can all bring to a shared problem. So.
Well, that's and Plaid Cymru've got your number, I hope. That sounds like something that could be an exciting direction for Wales, with all the clean sheets and the clean slates and all the other things.
Well, and I think it's such an important thing, Gary. It's we know, the crisis of our times is the crisis of the imagination. And there's a brilliant line by Frederick Jameson when he argued, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? And I think that we have this real crisis of the political imagination, and the only way we're going to get ourselves out of that is by listening to artists and listening to creative producers and making them an integral part of the conversation of policy making and the integral part of the conversation around academic discussion. I just got so tired when I'd see academics in politics departments talk a great deal about art and aesthetics and the visual and the image, and they'd never spoken to a bloody artist in their life. They would just take the ideas and appropriate them and repackage them and say, hey, this is my great aesthetic idea, and just living with an artist. The way I write about aesthetics today, I would never have got to that point had I not basically listened to an artist. I plagiarize her a lot now, but it's kind of, no, I mean, we co-write together, but it is, that if you want to understand aesthetics or you want to understand the imagination, you have to engage with artists, and that's a pretty self-evident thing, I think, and I think policymakers are more and more open to that as well. So it's how do we kind of use that as an opportunity for reimagining the future, which can often seem like a cliche, but I think it is absolutely urgent, especially for young people in places like South Wales today. So.
Brilliantly positive note to end on after possibly a few dour moments earlier during the conversation. But that's great. Thanks, Brad. I appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time to talk.
No, wonderful, Gary. And always a pleasure chatting.
With an audience of one.